Before we get into the conversation, here's 2 clips from the movie. Welcome back. Before we get into the movie, the one question I like asking you guys is, even with how popular the film has been so far, after all these screenings, Q&As, even just running into people on the street, do you find it interesting how many times it's almost the first time they've seen it, or have you been running into audience members that have seen it 2, 3, 4 times?
I think, first of all, I want to thank Deadline for having us here. We appreciate it, and thank you all for showing up. Thank you. It's a really an honor to be here in front of all of you and talk about a movie that took us 35 years to get made. But what's interesting about Top Gun, either people have seen it multiple times or they haven't seen it. I ran into a young lady and she told me that her company, they have a contest who's seen it the most times, and she's seen it 25 times. So it's fascinating to see how different audiences see it and some don't get to see it, but hopefully everybody will see it by the time the awards come.
Absolutely great. Out of curiosity, can I get a raise of hands? How many people have seen it more than once? Oh, boy. See, we get some fans in here, me? Through. Oh, how many haven't seen it, out of curiosity? Okay. IMAX re-release, it's this weekend, down the street. Feel free to go. So Joe, you pitched this movie, and your big selling point, especially to Tom, was Goose's son, and that bond and all that stuff. Once he was ready to rock and roll, I'm curious, going forward, what were some of those other challenges? Because I know he wanted to get in the planes, he wanted to do this. What did you think became those kind of top hurdles you had to overcome, and how did that come as production went along?
I mean, the main challenge is always the script, because that's where everything starts. So that's where all of our focus was, in that, I prepped this movie for 15 months. Those scenes are, I think, a perfect example of how we approach this film as a drama, first and foremost. And then, it has this action movie kind of wrapped around it. But if you don't have an emotional core to your film, then, ultimately the audience isn't going to care about who's in the plane or what happens to them. So the focus was always on story. And my job, was to try to get the absolute best cast we could to surround Tom with. And again, I think those clips show, just the power of a great performance, both from Miles Teller in that scene, which is actually the one we tested. Yeah, and then Jennifer Connelly, obviously, just doing an incredible job in the role of Penny Benjamin. And it's the performances that really make the film work. No matter how many fireworks you put in, how you shoot the action, you need characters that the audience connects with, and that all comes down to casting and script.
Jerry, when you first did the first time you did this film, Tom, I'm sure, was very hands-on, but he was only an actor at this time, and now 35 years later, he's your partner, so to speak. How was that you guys obviously worked at the Days of Thunder, or you've worked on other things, but how was this go around when he was in that producer's seat trying to build out this film? The both of you can answer that.
Well, he's a much better producer than I'll ever be. He is amazing, and anything Tom takes on, he's spectacular. But what's so interesting about Tom is he's like a sponge. He loves knowledge, loves to learn about things, loves to learn about filmmaking. How do you do this? How do you market that? And he's been a student from so many great producers and writers, and just look at the list of directors Tom has worked with. They're phenomenal. Spielberg and who else is he? Stanley Kubrick, Michael Mann. It just goes on and on and on who he's worked with, and he learns from everybody. So we were the beneficiary of all this knowledge on Top Gun. And what Top Gun is, like the first one, like Joe said, it's a drama. It's about the emotion. What makes this picture the success it's become is because there are characters you care about, and the movie is emotional. What's interesting about Top Gun, even though we did almost $1.5 billion, but foreign was bigger than domestic, which just goes to show you, when we in Hollywood get it right, we entertain the world, and we're so proud of that.
You know, Joe, back to the training that they had to do. You know, Tom was he made it clear that he wanted to get in the plane, in the cockpit to elevate this. I'm just curious, how impressed were you with that cast and crew and when it came to it? And since there's no actors here, I am curious this time. We won't tell Miles who got the sickest and had the roughest time getting through those G-forces.
I couldn't believe that, I knew we'd be able to get Tom in the plane. Tom's Tom is Tom. He can do anything, yeah. But we weren't sure about the rest of the cast. And so Tom devised this course, a kind of a 3-month course for all the actors to go through to kind of start in a very kind of simple airplane and work their way up to the Navy jet. And they all were able to do all their scenes in the jets for real, which is just phenomenal, because you can't imagine how physically difficult it is to do what they're doing. They're flying with real Top Gun pilots. They're doing the same maneuvers or even more intense maneuvers than they normally would do in training. And they were all incredible. And even if they did get sick, they would keep shooting, and get the material, because they knew how special it was to have that time in the jet. So I was blown away that they were all able to do it. But yeah, I think a couple of them had a hard time, but they wouldn't let me know. They would actually kind of keep it under wraps just because they wanted to make sure we were getting everything we need to get.
Just how difficult it was for these actors. First of all, Joe rehearsed them on the ground. He built like a little cockpit there and rehearsed them. And then he sent them up in the air. This is after 3 months of training, and they had to go through water survival, which they put them in a kind of a cage. This is just one of the things they do. Put them in a cage, blindfold them, dump them in the water, about, 6 or 8 feet down, or 10 feet down, turn them upside down, and if they figure out how to get out of that cage. That's just one of the maneuvers they had to do. So they went through the same kind of training that a pilot would go through to get this part. And when we put them up in the air, they were up in the air for at least an hour. A lot of them threw up. They had to redo their makeup. They had to turn the camera on. They had to know where the sun was, because we shot stuff earlier in the morning, so they had to match that. Now, also, what's kind of spectacular, I think, is the only person that didn't throw up was Monica. She's the only one. Our female was the one who was the strongest of all.
One of the cooler things when I remember at the premiere in San Diego, the military presence there, and you could just tell walking out of that theater how happy they were with what happened. I'm curious, in the time since, you mentioned all the fighter pilots involved in the film, but I'm curious what their response has been when they've come up to you following that, because you could sense those guys were so impressed with what you guys did.
It's been incredible. The first thing I did after kind of jumping on board with Jerry was I went out to the Teddy Roosevelt carrier for a couple days. So to kind of figure out what the world was like, who these men and women were, but they also had a lot to do with figuring out the structure of the film. I mean, that whole final mission that we learn about in the film came out of a discussion with a bunch of Top Gun pilots where I said, what is the scariest, toughest, gnarliest mission you could ever imagine being sent on? And the answer they gave me is what you see on screen. The only thing they added was, and you do it at night. So you can imagine, what these men and women are capable of doing. But yeah, I think for us, one of the most special screenings was the first time we showed it to all the Navy personnel down in San Diego, and to hear them, whooping and cheering while we, as the film was playing was really, really gratifying.
Now, one of my last questions before we leave today, we've talked over and over again, 2021 there were some films that had helped get audience back in there, but it's hard not to look at this film and think of the theatrical experience and how it did, reinvigorate it when this industry and the world in general was worried about that experience. I'm curious, especially from you, Jerry, legacy standpoints with film. There's people talk about various things with movies, but 5, 10, 15 years from now, what do you hope that the legacy of this film is, especially when it comes to that theatrical experience?
Well, I think that'll hold up like the first one did. 35 years later, and we packed theaters, and the first audiences that came in to see Top Gun had their arms folded. Said, oh We love the first one. There's no way you can come close to that. And as soon as they heard Danger Zone and the music, and they saw the jets taking off, they put their arms by their side and relaxed and watched the movie. But the effect on this movie, like I said, around the world, it brought audiences, older audiences back to the cinemas, which helped all the movies this year that came out after it. It showed it was safe to go back. It showed that we know how to create entertainment, and we can make you feel something. And that's what's so important about Top Gun. A young girl came up to me in the last screening we had and said, my dad was suicidal at one day in his life. I took him to see Top Gun, and he got renewed vigor, and he's much, much better. So we can move people. We're in the transportation business. We move you from one place to another emotionally. And that's what Top Gun accomplished around the world.
One more question, yeah. Maybe, I think you have to talk Tom into it, but, Pete Mitchell one more time, or did he float into the sun officially?
What really happened is Joe and I flew to Paris while Tom was shooting one of the Mission Impossibles. And Joe pitched the idea of Goose's son. And Tom looked at him and said, Joe, the one thing you gotta promise me is we do everything for real. Everybody goes in that plane and we don't make it. And then Tom picked the phone, called the powers that be of Paramount and said, I want to make another Top Gun. And that's exactly what Joe did. He figured out how to get 6 cameras in that cockpit, put every actor in it, train them for 3 months. What these kids went through was brutal to get to actually be in this movie, and you can see it on their faces for you that have seen it. It's just amazing what they go through. That's not acting, they're really feeling it.
And you're asking if we're going to go again? I mean, I think, yeah. Well, listen, I think we're all enjoying the way that this film is being received, and we're all, busy thinking about what we're all working on next, including Tom, who right now is strapped to a biplane somewhere in South Africa, shooting something amazing. But I think it'll all come down to the same thing: story. Is there another story that is compelling enough that we need to go back and see? But it seems to me at the end of this film that Maverick has some gas left in the tank. I think he's not settling down. So,
ladies and gentlemen, Top Gun Maverick.
Thank you.